Have you ever wondered why someone who seemed so distant, so emotionally unavailable, somehow finds their way back into your life months or even years later? It's confusing, isn't it? One moment they are pulling away, building walls, acting like the connection never mattered. And the next moment, something shifts, a message appears, a like on social media, a sudden check-in. It feels almost mysterious, like the universe quietly brought them back when you least expected it. But what if this isn't random at all? What if there is a psychological pattern behind it? What if there is a reason why so many emotionally distant people return to the very connection they once ran from? The truth is, people with avoidant tendencies often come back, but not for the reasons most people think. And here is the surprising part. The more you chase them, the more they disappear. But when you shift your energy in a very specific way, something fascinating begins to happen inside their mind. The same person who once ran from closeness begins to feel drawn back to you. Not because you forced them, not because you convinced them, but because something about your presence becomes impossible for them to ignore. If you've ever loved someone who pulled away emotionally, then you already know how painful that experience can be. You replay conversations in your mind. You question what went wrong. You wonder if they ever truly cared about you at all. And sometimes the silence they leave behind feels louder than any words they could have spoken. But here is something important to understand. Their distance was never really about you. It was about the way their mind has learned to survive emotional closeness. And once you understand this deeper truth, you begin to realize something powerful. The dynamic between you and them was never fixed. It was always shifting beneath the surface. And when you change the way you respond to their distance, you change the entire emotional gravity of the connection. Suddenly, the roles begin to reverse. The one who once pulled away starts wondering about you. The one who once avoided vulnerability begins to feel a strange pull back toward the person they left behind. And this is where everything starts to change. To understand why this happens, we first need to look at why emotionally distant people run from love in the first place. On the outside, they often appear confident, independent, and unaffected by emotional closeness. They might even convince others that they simply prefer freedom over commitment. But beneath that surface lies a very different reality. Deep inside, many of them learned very early in life that closeness can feel overwhelming. Emotional vulnerability can feel dangerous. Opening their heart can feel like losing control. So instead of leaning into connection, their mind developed a different strategy: distance, independence, self-protection. When someone gets too close, something inside them quietly activates. It's not always conscious. In fact, most of the time they don't even understand why they feel the urge to pull away. But suddenly, small things begin to feel too intense. The conversations become too deep. The expectations feel too heavy. And the connection that once felt exciting begins to trigger an invisible alarm inside their nervous system. So what do? They create space. Sometimes it happens slowly. Communication becomes less frequent. Emotional warmth fades. Plans become uncertain. Other times it happens suddenly, like a door closing without warning, and the person on the other side of that door is left wondering what just happened. The painful part is that the feelings they had for you may have been real. They may have genuinely enjoyed the connection. They may have felt something rare and meaningful with you. But when closeness reached a certain emotional depth, their protective instincts took over. Their mind told them distance equals safety, and so they ran. But here's where things become even more complicated. Even though they run from closeness, it doesn't mean they stop feeling. In fact, many emotionally distant people carry a silent conflict inside them that very few people ever see. On one side of their heart, there is a genuine desire for connection. They want companionship. They want understanding. They want someone who sees them beyond their emotional armor. But on the other side of their mind, there is fear. Fear of being controlled. Fear of being overwhelmed. Fear of losing their independence. So they live in a constant internal tug-of-war. One moment they lean toward intimacy. The next moment they retreat into distance. And to the person who loves them, this push and pull can feel incredibly confusing. One day they seem deeply connected to you. The next day they appear emotionally unreachable. It feels like trying to hold on to someone who keeps drifting away just when you think you're finally getting close. But from their perspective, they are not trying to hurt you. They are simply responding to a deep emotional conditioning that tells them closeness equals vulnerability. And vulnerability feels risky, so they manage their emotions the only way they know how. They withdraw, they distract themselves, they convince themselves that independence is easier than intimacy. Yet despite all of this, something about a meaningful connection tends to linger in their mind long after they leave. This is why the story rarely ends the moment they walk away. When emotionally distant people first create distance, they often experience a strange sense of relief. The emotional pressure they were feeling suddenly disappears. The expectations fade. The intensity of the connection is no longer right in front of them. And for a while, this feels comfortable. They immerse themselves in distractions, work, hobbies, social circles, anything that keeps their mind moving forward. On the surface, it might look like they have completely moved on, but emotions rarely disappear that easily. As time passes and the emotional intensity fades, something else begins to happen quietly in the background of their mind. Memories start resurfacing. Small moments they shared with you begin to replay in unexpected ways. The laughter, the conversations, the feeling of being understood in a way they don't often experience with others. At first, these memories appear briefly, like passing thoughts, but over time they become more persistent, especially if the connection they had with you felt rare or meaningful. And here is the fascinating psychological shift that many people don't realize. When someone with avoidant tendencies is no longer feeling pressure or expectation from the relationship, their mind begins to process the emotional value of what they lost. Without realizing it, the distance they created begins to change their perspective. The space they once wanted becomes the space where reflection begins. And eventually, there comes a moment when curiosity starts to grow. They begin wondering about you. What are you doing now? Did you move on? Are you happy without them? These questions often arise when they least expect it. Maybe they hear a song that reminds them of you. Maybe they see something that triggers a memory of a conversation you once had. Maybe they notice your absence in a way they never allowed themselves to before. And this is often the moment when emotionally distant people begin missing someone they once pushed away. Not because they suddenly changed overnight, not because they fully resolved their fears, but because distance gave them something they didn't have before: perspective. The emotional intensity that once made them run is no longer overwhelming. Instead, what remains is the memory of a connection that felt different from the rest, a connection that felt genuine. And when that realization begins to sink in, the walls they built may not feel as necessary as they once did. Suddenly, the person they ran from becomes the person they start thinking about again. The silence they created begins to feel heavier than the closeness they once feared. And that's when the story between you and them quietly begins to shift in ways neither of you may have expected. And this is exactly where many people unknowingly make the mistake that pushes emotionally distant partners even further away. When someone you care about suddenly creates distance, the natural instinct is to fight for the connection. Your heart tells you to reach out more, explain your feelings, remind them of the love you shared, and try to fix whatever went wrong. You replay the last conversations in your mind and wonder if one more message might change everything. You think that if they could just understand how much you care, they would come back. But for someone who struggles with emotional closeness, this reaction often creates the opposite effect. The more pressure they feel, the more their instincts tell them to retreat. Every message filled with longing can feel overwhelming to someone whose mind associates closeness with losing control. It's not that your feelings are wrong. In fact, your desire to repair the connection is one of the most human reactions possible. But to someone who fears emotional intensity, that same sincerity can feel like a weight they don't know how to carry. So instead of coming closer, they create even more distance. They may respond less frequently, they may become colder in their communication, and sometimes they disappear completely, leaving you with silence that feels incredibly painful. What many people don't realize is that chasing someone who fears intimacy only confirms the belief they already have inside. The belief that relationships will eventually demand more emotional energy than they feel capable of giving. And when that belief gets reinforced, their mind convinces them that leaving was the right decision, not because they stopped caring, but because their emotional defenses feel justified. But something very different begins to happen when the dynamic changes, when you stop chasing, when you stop trying to convince someone to stay, and when you slowly begin to shift your focus back to your own life. A subtle transformation takes place. Emotional independence has a strange and powerful effect on people who are used to distance. When they sense that you are no longer relying on them for emotional stability, the pressure they once felt begins to disappear. And for the first time, they can look at the connection without feeling trapped by it. Imagine the difference between someone holding your hand tightly because they are afraid you will leave, and someone walking beside you freely without needing to control your steps. One feels heavy, the other feels peaceful. Emotionally distant individuals are often drawn toward people who embody that sense of calm independence, someone who doesn't chase them but also doesn't punish them with resentment, someone who continues living their life, growing, evolving, and finding happiness without demanding constant reassurance. When they see that kind of strength, something unexpected happens inside them. Curiosity begins to replace avoidance. They start noticing that the emotional pressure they once feared is no longer present, and that absence of pressure creates space for attraction to quietly return. This is where the power of emotional detachment begins to reveal itself. Emotional detachment does not mean you stop caring. It doesn't mean you erase the memories or pretend the connection never mattered. It simply means you stop holding on to someone so tightly that your happiness depends on their presence. You begin focusing on your own growth, your own peace, and your own emotional balance. At first, this shift is difficult. Your mind still wonders if they will come back. Your heart still remembers the connection you shared. But little by little, your energy begins to change. Instead of waiting for their message, you start creating new experiences in your life. Instead of analyzing every detail of the past, you start investing in the present moment. And something remarkable happens when someone who once depended on another person's attention becomes centered within themselves. Their energy becomes lighter, more confident, more grounded. And this kind of emotional stability has a magnetic quality that emotionally distant individuals often struggle to ignore. Because deep down, they crave connection that feels safe rather than demanding. When they see that you are no longer emotionally chasing them, their mind begins to reconsider the entire situation. They may start wondering why you seem different now. They may notice that your absence feels more significant than they expected. And without even realizing it, they begin paying attention again. Silence, in this stage, becomes incredibly powerful. Not the kind of silence filled with resentment or hidden anger, but the quiet space that naturally forms when someone stops forcing communication. When you allow that space to exist without trying to constantly fill it, it creates something emotionally distant people rarely experience. Room to breathe, room to think, room to miss what once felt overwhelming. Many people underestimate how strongly silence can influence the human mind. When someone knows you are always available, always ready to respond instantly, your presence can start to feel predictable. But when that constant availability disappears, curiosity begins to grow. They may start checking your social media more often. They may think about reaching out but hesitate, unsure of how you might respond. They may even replay past conversations in their mind, wondering if they misunderstood the depth of the connection. Silence gives their emotions time to surface without feeling pressured. It allows them to reflect on what the relationship meant to them, without the defensive walls that once protected them. And for someone who spent so much time running from closeness, this reflection can feel surprisingly powerful. As the silence continues and your life moves forward, another psychological shift often begins to unfold. Human attraction has a strange tendency to intensify when something once familiar becomes uncertain. When emotionally distant individuals sense that they might actually lose someone who was once deeply connected to them, their perspective can change dramatically. What once felt like freedom can start to feel like absence. What once felt like relief can slowly turn into curiosity. And curiosity is often the first step toward renewed interest. They might begin wondering if someone else has taken their place in your life. They may ask mutual friends about you. They may pay closer attention to subtle signs that reveal whether you have truly moved on. This is not about playing games or trying to manipulate someone's emotions. It is simply the natural psychological effect that occurs when the balance of emotional energy shifts. When someone who once seemed deeply attached suddenly becomes independent, it forces the other person to reassess the connection they once took for granted, and that reassessment can awaken feelings they previously tried to suppress. Confidence plays an enormous role in this transformation. Not the kind of confidence that comes from pretending you don't care, but the quiet confidence that grows when someone truly begins valuing their own life again. When emotionally distant individuals see that you are thriving without them, it challenges the narrative their mind once created. The narrative that you would always be waiting, always hoping, always available, no matter how far they pulled away. Instead, they see someone who is evolving, someone who is building a life that feels meaningful, regardless of who stays or leaves, and this realization can be surprisingly powerful for someone who is used to emotional distance. Because deep down, many avoidant individuals respect strength more than emotional pursuit. They are drawn toward people who can stand on their own without needing constant validation. When they see that strength in you, something shifts inside their perception. The person they once viewed as emotionally dependent now appears independent and self-assured, and that new image can reignite attraction in a way that chasing never could. Slowly, the dynamic begins to reverse itself. The one who once ran from closeness may start feeling drawn back toward it, not because they suddenly changed their entire personality, but because the emotional environment around the connection has transformed. The pressure that once triggered their defenses is gone. The person they left behind is no longer chasing them. Instead, they are living fully, confidently, and peacefully. And for someone who quietly struggles with intimacy, that kind of presence can feel incredibly intriguing. It raises questions they cannot easily ignore. What if the connection could feel different now? What if closeness no longer means losing their freedom? What if the person they once walked away from has become someone even more emotionally balanced than before? These questions begin to open the door to something they once avoided, and sometimes that door leads them right back to the person they never fully forgot. And this is the stage where something even more subtle begins to happen. Long before emotionally distant people actually return, they often start observing you from a distance, not always in obvious ways. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's indirect. But the curiosity that once lived silently in their mind slowly turns into small actions. They may start checking your social media more frequently than before. A story gets viewed within minutes. A post receives a like that seems almost accidental. Sometimes they might even send a simple message that feels casual, almost as if nothing ever happened. "Hey, how have you been?" On the surface it looks small, almost insignificant, but beneath that simple message is something much deeper. It's a test. Emotionally distant people often test the emotional environment before stepping back into it. They want to see if things feel safe. They want to know if the emotional pressure that once overwhelmed them is still there. So they reach out in ways that feel controlled and low risk. A short message, a random reaction, a brief conversation that ends quickly. They are watching your response more closely than you might realize, not just your words, but your energy. If they sense desperation, emotional pressure, or lingering resentment, their instinct may immediately push them back into distance again. But if they feel calmness, confidence, and emotional balance from you, something inside them begins to relax. It tells them that maybe this connection could exist in a different way than before, and that quiet sense of safety can slowly encourage them to move closer again. At this point, many people feel a surge of hope. After all the silence, the absence, and the emotional confusion, suddenly the person who once walked away is standing at the edge of your life again. Your heart might want to rush forward and rebuild everything immediately. You might feel tempted to talk about the past, explain how much you missed them, or ask the questions that have been sitting in your mind for months. Why did you leave? Did you ever think about me? Do you still care? But responding this way can unintentionally recreate the same emotional intensity that once caused them to pull away. When emotionally distant people come back, they are often moving cautiously, trying to understand whether the connection will feel overwhelming again. The most powerful response in this moment is calm confidence. Instead of reacting with emotional urgency, you respond with presence. You show them that your life continued, that your happiness did not disappear in their absence, that the connection may still exist, but it no longer defines your entire world. This kind of energy can feel incredibly grounding to someone who fears emotional pressure. It shows them that closeness does not have to mean losing freedom, that relationships can exist without constant demands, and this is often when they begin opening up more than they ever did before. Another fascinating aspect of emotionally distant personalities is the way they quietly evaluate emotional safety. While many people believe love alone is enough to hold a relationship together, avoidant individuals often value something slightly different. They value boundaries. Clear, calm boundaries create a sense of respect and predictability that makes them feel safer within a connection. When someone constantly sacrifices their own needs just to keep a relationship alive, it can unintentionally make emotionally distant individuals uncomfortable, not because they want to hurt you, but because deep down they know that imbalance cannot last forever. Boundaries change that dynamic. When you show that you respect yourself, your time, and your emotional well-being, it communicates strength. It shows that you are capable of loving someone without losing yourself in the process. And this balance is something emotionally distant individuals often struggle to find in relationships. When they see it in someone else, it can feel incredibly attractive. Not in a dramatic or overwhelming way, but in a quiet sense of stability that draws them closer over time. As the connection slowly rebuilds, something else begins to shift inside their perception. They start recognizing the emotional space you once created for them, the patience, the understanding, the moments when you accepted them even when they struggled to express themselves fully. These memories become clearer with distance. When they look back at past relationships or interactions with others, they may realize that the kind of connection they had with you was not something they easily find again. Many emotionally distant people move through life surrounded by acquaintances, casual relationships, and temporary distractions. But deep emotional understanding is rare for them, and when they finally begin to process that rarity, they often start realizing the true value of the person they once walked away from. This realization rarely happens instantly. It grows slowly, almost quietly, but once it settles into their awareness, it becomes difficult to ignore. There is also a deeper fear that begins to surface during this stage, a fear that many emotionally distant individuals rarely admit, even to themselves, the fear of losing someone who truly understood them. When they first created distance, they may have believed they could easily replace the connection. After all, independence feels safe and familiar. But as time passes and they experience other interactions that feel shallow or emotionally distant in a different way, they begin recognizing something important. Not everyone sees them the way you did. Not everyone offered the same patience, the same emotional space, or the same genuine care. And that realization can create a quiet sense of loss that grows stronger over time. Suddenly, the person they once avoided becomes someone they feel afraid of losing completely. And this is often the moment when their perspective fully shifts. The emotional distance that once protected them begins to feel less important than the connection they might lose. They may start reaching out more frequently. Conversations become longer. Their tone becomes warmer. You might notice them sharing small personal details they once kept hidden. These are subtle signs that their emotional walls are lowering, even if they are not fully aware of it themselves. But here is the most important thing to remember during this stage. Their return is not just about them rediscovering you, it is also about the transformation that happened within you, the growth that occurred when you stopped chasing, the strength that developed when you chose to focus on your own life rather than waiting for someone else to complete it. That transformation is the very thing that made this reconnection possible. When emotionally distant people sense that kind of emotional stability, they often feel something they rarely experience in relationships: safety. Not the safety of control or distance, but the safety of knowing they can be themselves without constant pressure. And for someone who spent so much of their life protecting their independence, that kind of connection can feel incredibly powerful. It makes them question the beliefs that once caused them to run. It makes them wonder if intimacy might not be as overwhelming as they once believed. And sometimes that curiosity leads them back to the very connection they once tried to escape. But the most beautiful part of this entire journey is not simply that they come back. It's that by the time they do, you are no longer the same person who once felt lost in their absence. You have rediscovered your own emotional center. You have rebuilt your confidence. You have learned that your value never depended on someone else's ability to stay. And when you meet them again from that place of strength, the dynamic between you is completely different. No longer built on fear of loss, but on mutual respect, emotional balance, and the quiet understanding that real connection cannot be forced. It can only grow when both people feel free enough to choose it. And when this moment finally arrives, when the person who once walked away slowly finds their way back into your life, it can feel almost surreal. There was a time when you wondered if you would ever hear from them again. A time when the silence felt endless and the memories felt heavier than anything you could carry. But now they are here again, reaching out, reconnecting, stepping cautiously back into the space that once existed between you. The most important thing to understand in this moment is that the way you respond now will shape everything that comes next. Many people, after waiting so long, feel an overwhelming desire to immediately rebuild the relationship exactly as it was before. The heart wants to rush forward. It wants to recover the closeness, the intensity, the emotional depth that once existed. But when someone has struggled with emotional closeness in the past, moving too quickly can recreate the same pressure that caused them to pull away before. This is why the strongest response you can offer is calm emotional stability. When they come back, you welcome the conversation without losing your center. You show warmth without surrendering your boundaries. You allow the connection to grow naturally, rather than forcing it back into the shape it once had. In many ways, this moment is not about restarting the past. It's about building something healthier than what existed before. When emotionally distant people return, they are often observing something very closely. They are trying to understand whether the emotional environment between you has truly changed. In the past, they may have felt overwhelmed by expectations, intensity, or the fear of losing their independence. But when they see that you have grown into someone who can hold both connection and independence at the same time, it changes their entire perception of the relationship. Instead of feeling trapped, they begin to feel curious. Instead of feeling pressured, they begin to feel safe. Safety is something emotionally distant individuals rarely experience in relationships. Many of them have spent years believing that intimacy eventually leads to losing themselves. But when they reconnect with someone who respects their space while also maintaining emotional warmth, it challenges those old beliefs. They start realizing that closeness does not have to feel suffocating, that love can exist without constant demands or emotional conflict. And when that realization settles into their mind, something remarkable begins to unfold. The same person who once resisted connection may slowly begin leaning toward it. At this stage, your presence becomes incredibly important, not because you are trying to convince them to stay, but because the way you carry yourself communicates something powerful. When you remain grounded in your own life, when your happiness is no longer dependent on their choices, you create an emotional atmosphere that feels balanced and stable. They can sense that you care, but they also see that your world continues moving forward, regardless of what they decide. This balance removes the invisible pressure that once existed between you, and without that pressure, their natural curiosity about the connection has room to grow. Conversations begin to deepen. They may start asking questions about your life, your experiences, and the changes that happened while you were apart. These moments are often their way of reconnecting emotionally, without feeling exposed. Each conversation becomes a small step toward rebuilding trust. And over time, those small steps can slowly transform into something meaningful again. But there is one essential truth that must remain clear throughout this entire process. Your role is not to shrink yourself to make them comfortable. Your role is not to silence your needs or sacrifice your emotional well-being just to keep them from leaving again. Real connection cannot grow from fear. It cannot survive in a space where one person constantly abandons themselves to maintain peace. Instead, the healthiest relationships are built when both people feel free enough to be authentic. This means you continue honoring your boundaries, you continue valuing your time and emotional energy, and you allow the relationship to evolve in a way that respects both individuals equally. Ironically, this kind of strength is exactly what emotionally distant people often find most attractive, because deep down they are drawn toward people who do not lose themselves in love. When they begin to sense that kind of emotional strength in you, another shift takes place inside their mind. The connection no longer feels like something they must escape from. Instead, it starts to feel like something they want to protect. They may become more present during conversations. They may begin sharing pieces of themselves they once kept hidden. Sometimes they even acknowledge the distance that once existed between you, not with defensiveness, but with a quiet sense of reflection. These moments are powerful because they show that their walls are slowly lowering, not because you forced them down, but because they no longer feel necessary. When someone feels emotionally safe, the need for distance begins to fade naturally. And as this connection continues to rebuild, you may notice something else happening beneath the surface. The dynamic between you has completely changed. In the past, you may have felt like the one chasing clarity, searching for reassurance, trying to hold the connection together. But now the energy feels different. Now the relationship exists in a space where both people have the freedom to choose each other rather than feeling obligated to stay. That freedom is what makes the connection stronger. Because when someone chooses to be present without pressure, their presence carries far more meaning. This is also where many emotionally distant individuals finally confront something they spent years avoiding, their fear of intimacy. For a long time, distance may have protected them from confronting their deeper emotions. But when they reconnect with someone who feels safe and balanced, they begin realizing that closeness does not always lead to chaos. Sometimes it leads to understanding, sometimes it leads to growth, and sometimes it leads to the kind of connection they secretly hoped for but never believed they could sustain. That realization can be incredibly powerful. It can inspire them to approach relationships differently than they did in the past. Slowly, they may begin allowing themselves to experience vulnerability in ways they once resisted. And yet, the most important lesson in this entire journey is not simply about whether someone returns. It's about the transformation that happens within you while you wait, heal, and grow. Because when you first experience their distance, it may have felt like rejection. It may have made you question your worth, your value, or your ability to be loved deeply. But through that experience, something inside you strengthened. You learned how to stand on your own emotional foundation. You discovered that your happiness does not depend on someone else's presence. You realized that real love never asks you to abandon yourself, and that realization changes everything. By the time the person who once walked away begins moving closer again, you are no longer the same version of yourself who felt lost in their absence. You are someone who understands their own value more clearly. Someone who knows that connection is beautiful, but self-respect is essential. And when you approach relationships from that place of emotional clarity, something incredible happens. You attract connections that feel more balanced, more respectful, and more genuine. So yes, many emotionally distant people do come back. Not always because they planned to, and not always because they suddenly changed overnight. They come back because distance eventually reveals the emotional significance of what they left behind. They come back because curiosity grows when someone they once knew becomes stronger, calmer, and more independent. They come back because genuine connection is rare, and deep down they recognize that rarity, even if they once tried to escape it. But the real power in this story was never about making someone return. The real power was about becoming someone who no longer needs to chase love to deserve it. When you reach that point, everything shifts. The energy you carry becomes magnetic. Your presence feels grounded and peaceful. And the connections that enter your life from that moment forward are drawn to the strength you discovered within yourself. And sometimes the person who once walked away is the one who feels that change the most. Because when they look at you again, they no longer see someone waiting for their return. They see someone who grew beyond the pain, someone who found their own light again, someone who chose themselves. And that quiet transformation is often the very thing that makes them realize they never truly forgot you in the first place.